It is Monday, April the 11th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, the collapse of parenting, the second part of Chapter 1, the culture of disrespect, and Uncle Albert's Apple Farm, Chapter 11 from the book Tales from My Bicentennial Year. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for April the 11th. Be released from the curse of sickness and infirmity. Do not fear that you have been inflicted with a curse of sickness and infirmity. For just as my Son went all about healing all kinds of sickness and disease, so have I broken the curse of sickness from your life. I have given you power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of diseases. I have given you my promise to bring health and healing to you and to heal you and reveal to you an abundance of peace and truth. I will seek that which was lost and bring again that which was driven away, and will bind up that which was broken, and will strengthen that which was sick. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, chapter 10, verse 1, Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 6, and Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 16. Prayer declaration. Father, you are my great physician, and you have promised to bind up my broken body and to strengthen me when I am sick. You have released me from the curse of death and destruction, and have freed me from all curses of sickness and infirmity in the name of your Son, Jesus. You have blessed my life and filled me with the blessing of good health. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for April the 11th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes, He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Number one, we must properly define conservatism. Then we must organize all potential conservatives under that definition. Once organized, we must dominate American culture. Dominating American culture means that we must rid ourselves of all the various cults the left has foisted upon us in this country. We rid ourselves of the left-wing cults by promoting value. What are the universal values? Number one, life. Number two, privacy. Number three, time. Number four, sanity. Number five, productivity. We defeat promiscuity by promoting family and privacy. Socialists must be driven from positions of power. And since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And we change the culture by getting married, creating a family, and raising our children. Thank you, thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. True conservatives need to defeat the useful idiots on the left that populate their households, workplaces, and churches. That means don't be neutral. Don't try to prove a negative. Don't take their word for it, and ask lots of questions. The useful idiots are the people that simply repeat the latest talking points. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number one, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number two, make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number three, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number four, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number five, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number six, the immediate repeal of all emergency dictator laws. Number seven, the reinstatement of writs of outlawry. Number eight, government-sponsored recalls, ballot initiatives, and referendums. 9, a flexible minimum wage. And 10, means-tested health care. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative cultural priorities? Bring back not-for-profit news. Number 2, destroy the cult of promiscuity. Replace with an emphasis on privacy. Number 3, destroy the cult of neutrality with the effective use of propaganda. Number 4, destroy the cult of personality by emphasizing character. Number 5, destroy the cult of imagination, psychologists, and Hollywood. Number 6, destroy the cult of reinvention by admitting your mistakes. Thank you, thank you. The biggest mistakes that right-wing talk show hosts make. Number 1, they fail to consult their consciences. Number 2, they fail to listen to their own shows. Number 3, they aid and abet the left. Number 4, they demoralize their audiences. Number 5, they contradict themselves. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. The rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. Unquote, Adam Smith. The sinful nature of man cannot be lost on those of us defending free enterprise. Our case is not that mankind's fall is suspended when he transacts in the marketplace. It is that the marketplace best tames our fallen nature. Our case is not that collective well-being is more important to the entrepreneur than his or her individual well-being. It is that what is best for the individual is most connected to what is best for the collective in a market economy. A public life that is oriented around free exchange between producers and consumers will create a far more cooperative and mutually beneficial result than any alternative ever considered in the annals of history. And that was There's No Free Lunch. Thank you. And now the second part of Chapter 1 of the book, The Collapse of Parenting. And this is called The Culture of Disrespect. The issue isn't always that parents are unwilling to assert their authority. Sometimes they believe that they're helping their children by stepping back and letting their kids decide. Here's an example of what not to do. In other words, an example of how many Americans' parents now behave. Megan and Jim, both 40-something parents, had planned a 4-day ski vacation between Christmas and New Year's. Their 12-year-old daughter, Courtney, politely declined to join them. "You know, I'm not crazy about skiing," she said. "I'll just stay at Arden's house for those 4 days." Her parents said it's okay. They have a spare guest room and everything. So her parents went on the ski vacation by themselves, and Courtney spent 4 days at the home of her best friend. "I didn't mind. In fact, I was pleased that Courtney could be so independent," Megan told me. But Megan is mistaken. Courtney isn't independent. No 12-year-old truly is. Instead, Courtney has transferred her natural dependence from her parents, where it should be, to her same-age peers, where it shouldn't be. Courtney's top priorities now lie in pleasing her friends, being liked by her friends, being accepted by same-age peers. Her parents have become an afterthought, a means to other ends. You can see how good parents who love their kids can fall into this trap. You love your child. It's natural to want to please someone you love. If your daughter doesn't want to join you and your spouse on a ski vacation, it feels harsh to say, "Nevertheless, despite your protests, you're going to come with us." But that's what you must say. Why? Because having fun together is one foundation of authoritative parenting in the modern world. Because if most of the time good times come when kids are having fun with other kids, then it's no wonder that kids don't want to spend more time with adults. Because your kids won't value time with you above time with same-age peers if they rarely spend any time with you doing fun stuff. That's part of what it means to exercise parental authority. I just mentioned Dr. Newfield, a Canadian psychologist who recently retired from active practice after 40 years of working with children and adolescents. Over the past 4 decades, he observed firsthand a fundamental change in the ways in which kids across North America form and prioritize attachments. 40 years ago, kids' primary attachment was to their parents. Today, for most kids in the United States and Canada, kids' primary attachment is to other kids. For the first time in history, Newfield observes, young people are turning for instruction, modeling, and guidance, not to mothers, fathers, teachers, and other responsible adults, but to people whom nature never intended to place in a parenting role, their own peers. Children are being brought up by immature persons who cannot possibly guide them to maturity. They're being brought up by each other. Today, most North American kids care more about the good regard of their peers than they care about the good regard of their parents. Neufeld describes a girl, Cynthia, who had become rude, secretive, and sometimes hostile toward her parents while remaining happy and charming when around her friends. She was obsessive about her privacy and insistent that her life was none of her parents' business. Her mother and father found it difficult to speak to her without being made to feel intrusive. Their previously loving daughter appeared to be less and less comfortable in their company. It was impossible to sustain any conversation with her. I personally have found this scenario common with kids from elementary through high school, not only in my medical practice, but in my meetings with parents all across the United States. How best to understand it? Newfield asks, imagine that your spouse or lover suddenly begins to act strangely, won't look you in the eye, rejects physical contact, speaks to you irritably in monosyllables, shuns your approaches, and avoids your company. Then imagine that you go to your friends for advice. Would they say to you, have you tried a timeout? Have you imposed limits and made clear what your expectations are? It would be obvious to everyone that in the context of adult interaction, you're dealing not with a behavior problem, but a relationship problem. And probably the first suspicion to arise would be that your partner was having an affair. Neufeld observes that the primary problem in Cynthia's relationship with her parents is that she has come to value her attachment to her peers more than her attachment to her parents. Once this happens, any attempt by parents to set limits on a child's interactions with peers, for example, no texting or phone calls after 9, can prompt sulking or a tantrum. Parents need to recognize such tantrums or sulking as symptoms of a shift in the child's primary attachment from parents to their peers. Too often, parents today allow their desire to please their child to govern their parenting. If your relationship with your child is governed by your own desire to be loved by him or her, the odds are good that you will not achieve even that objective. Something hardwired is going on here. The child expects to look up to the parent, to be instructed by the parent, indeed to be commanded by the parent. If the parent instead serves the child, then that relationship falls out of its natural balance. You may not earn your child's love at all, and the more you try, the more pathetically unsuccessful you may be. I've seen precisely this dynamic play out at least 100 times in my own medical practice over the past quarter century. The parent who puts the child's wishes first may earn only the child's contempt, not their love. But if you're not primarily concerned about winning your child's love and affection and focused instead on your duties as a parent, teaching your child right from wrong and communicating what it means to be a responsible man or woman, a gentleman or a lady, within the constraints of the culture you are trying to inculcate and to share, then you may find that your child loves and respects you when you're not looking for it. I recently visited multiple schools across Scotland, meeting with students, talking with parents, and leading workshops for teachers at each. To get to Scotland, I flew from Philadelphia to London Heathrow, then connected on a smaller plane to Edinburgh. I arrived well ahead of time for the long flight across the Atlantic on a big Airbus A330. Waiting at the gate in Terminal A at the Philadelphia International Airport, I watched an American family, a mother, father, teenage daughter, and 2 younger sons. "Where are my donuts?" one of the boys asked. He looked to be about 8 years old. "Sweetie, I thought we should save those for the plane," his mom said. "Where are my donuts? I want them right now," he said more loudly. "Honey, you just had dessert. Let's wait till I want them right now," he shouted at the top of his lungs. His mom looked guiltily around as though the TSA might arrest her. Without another word, she fished in her handbag and handed over the entire box of donuts. The voice of the gate attendant came over the public address system. "In a few minutes, we will begin boarding U.S. Airways Flight 728 to London's Heathrow Airport. We board by zone number. You will find your zone number on your boarding ticket. Please have your passport open to the photo page." The teenage daughter was texting on her cell phone. "Trish, it's time to put the cell phone away. We need to get ready to board," the mom said. Her daughter ignored her. "Trish, Mom, could you please shut up? Can't you see that I'm busy?" "Trish, we need to get ready to board." "The plane?" The mom's words sounded like questions. Her daughter continued to ignore her. Mom glanced at me. I felt uneasy and walked away. I could sense the mom's discomfort. I was uncomfortable too. But the kids were in their element, living in a different culture. Mom had not encultured her kids into her own culture. Instead, she was trying to adapt to the children's culture, the culture of disrespect, which they had learned from their peers. And while these kids might have been enjoying themselves at the moment, After a fashion, eating the donuts and texting, their parents' failure to inculture and instruct them rightly means that these kids will be ill-equipped to withstand the challenges of later adolescence and adulthood. Sometimes you have to wait before you eat the donuts. Sometimes you don't get to eat the donuts at all. That's life. And that's the end of section 2 of chapter 1 about the culture of disrespect. And next time will be chapter 2, why are so many kids overweight? Yeah. Thank you. And now, chapter 11, Uncle Albert's Apple Farm, from the book My Bicentennial, Tales from My Bicentennial Year. It's about a family living in Gansevoort, New York, in the Adirondacks in 1975. One of the fall family traditions was our annual outing to go pick apples and pumpkins for Halloween. Please remember that we lived in upstate New York, where apple orchards are a dime a dozen. There's one on every corner. But my mom liked this place called Uncle Albert's Apple Farm. She liked it because it was a nice scenic drive, and they let us kids roam all around, climb the trees, eat apples while we were picking them, which was all fine with us. The particular trip started as usual on this Saturday morning. My mom made sure we all had on jackets, as it was cool out today. I loved apples and apple picking. I liked to eat the delicious apples. They were sweet and firm. We all piled into our red, wood-paneled, white-walled tired Plymouth Fury 3 station wagon. I took my usual spot in the rumble seat with my sister Kathy. I always liked to be looking out the back window as we were driving forward. I could wave at the other drivers or some other goofy thing. The 3 younger kids sat on the big giant couch of a car seat behind Mom and Dad. The ride to Uncle Albert's Apple Farm was about an hour or so. I can only remember we had to take a road called Spire Falls Road, aptly named as when you drove on it, you passed over a small overlook of a creek with a small 2-foot version of Niagara Falls, which in this case was named Spire Falls. I'm sure it was named after great General Spire, who bravely defeated the British in the Battle of the Falls. In school and everywhere else, because the United States was celebrating its 200th year anniversary this upcoming summer, we were learning about everything colonial. My favorite bicentennial hero was John Hancock, for no other reason than my father worked for John Hancock Insurance. I somehow wanted to be loyal to my dad. I also liked that my dad used to bring home fake versions of the Declaration of Independence with John Hancock's big signature on it. John Hancock Insurance, I guess, did this for advertising. Everybody else seemed to pick General George Washington because he won it all. Spire Falls Road was a long one. It winded its way up and down the mountains. My mother, as always, was pointing out the fall foliage to us. My sister, Chris, was complaining that she had a headache. I was yelled at to stop picking on Chris, which I was not. But at that point, when you were in the back, you just sort of said, yeah, whatever. I liked to pretend as I was sitting back there looking out the road and all the trees that I had a great big axe tied to the back of the car, and it went out over into the trees. As we drove past the trees, my axe would chop them down. Hey, it may sound weird, but it gave me something to do. As I remind my own kids, we didn't have DVD players, iPod touches, Nintendo DS, etc. to entertain us in the car. We had scenery and each other. Finally, as we came down the other side of one of the mountains, you could see in the valley and off the right a big sign, Uncle Albert's Apple Farm. Back in a minute. Thank you. Uncle Albert's Apple Farm. You pick your own. Dad pulled into the parking lot, which was nothing more than a cow field. The car bounced up and down and finally rolled to a stop before a barbed wire fence with some cows behind it. The cows looked up at us like we were bothering them. As we piled out of the car, my dad stopped us all and said, "There it is, kids. Stop and take a deep breath," which we all did. "Can you smell it?" he asked. I smelled manure, I think. "Apples. Can't you smell the apples?" he asked. I guess I could. Before you go into the orchard and start picking, you had to go into the big barn and sign up. My father, always a character, asked the girl behind the makeshift counter, "Is Uncle Albert in? I've got a few kids here that wanted a job picking apples." The girl gave him one of those over-the-glasses looks that said, "Okay, funny man." She then called over to this big man in a straw cowboy hat. "Unc, we have a bunch of kids that want to say hi." The big man in the straw cowboy hat walked over to all of us and said, "My name's Uncle Albert. How may I help you?" My dad told Uncle Albert that these here young'uns were here today to work. They wanted to pick their own apples and get a few pumpkins. "Well," said Uncle Albert, "you've come to the right place." He bent over the makeshift counter, reached down, and grabbed some big canvas bags. He then handed us each a bag. "They're for the apples," he said. "Fill 'em up, and you're all done." As he was giving us the bags, he was ushering us over to the big barn doors and pointing up to the top of the hill. He was pointing out things to my mom. Up there on the right side of the path, you'll find the Macintosh. Across from that, the Delicious. Down towards the middle of the Granny Smith. Across from them are the Empires, and the pumpkin patches on the other side of the barn. Just walk up and start wherever you want. Dad gathered us all back up, and we started following my mom out the big barn doors. "Watch where you step," said my dad. "This is a working farm." "Yep, we got cows out in the pasture across the street and away from you all," said Uncle Albert. We probably got about 50 feet or so from the barn, headed up towards the top of the hill, when Uncle Albert yelled for us to stop. He waved for us to come back towards him and was headed out back behind the barn. We followed him, and as we got around the back of the barn, there was Uncle Albert sitting on top of a big old smelly tractor with a big wagon full of hay bales attached to it. "Why don't you all pile on the wagon, sit on a bale of hay, and we'll give you an old-fashioned hay ride to the top. Then you can walk down the hill picking your apples," said Uncle Albert. Kathy and I dove on the wagon and sat on the back of it on top of a couple of hay bales. The other kids sat close to Mom and Dad. "Be careful back there, don't fall off," said my mom. Uncle Albert started up the tractor. It took a little while to get going, a few fits and whirs, and then she was going. It was the loudest engine we ever heard. The whole wagon was shaking before we were even moving. We slowly started to gather up some speed, and away we went. It was a pretty bouncy ride to the top of the hill. "No shock absorbers here," my dad yelled to us. I had no idea what a shock absorber was, but whatever it was not here. We slowed down and pulled to a stop at the top of the hill. Uncle Albert got off the tractor, but left it running, and he walked back to help my mom down off the wagon. I looked over at my mom, and both she and my sister Chris were white as ghosts. It took a minute for the two of them to get their balance after getting down. Uncle Albert jumped back on the tractor, moved some level by his side, and hit the gas. He let out a wave and a yell. "Have fun. We'll see you down back at the bar. And remember, don't eat the apples with the worms in them." I had to ask my dad if he was kidding or not, because I certainly did not want to eat an apple with a worm in it. How could you tell? Dad asked us all, "Where do you want to start?" I suggested that we start at the trees that had the red delicious apples on them. Why would we want to pick apples that were anything but delicious? Several explanations later to me, I finally understood that a delicious apple was simply a kind of apple, just like empires, but that they could both be delicious tasting apples. We started basically at the top, which was my dad's plan all along, top to bottom, which, following his plan, is fine and all. He is the boss, but why ask us where we wanted to start if it really didn't matter to him anyway? Back in a minute. Thank you. Uncle Albert had given us each a large canvas sack to put the apples we picked in. My younger brother Kevin started picking up apples off the ground, biting them and then throwing them into his sack. My sister Kathy and I began climbing the trees. It was pretty cool to be up in the trees and looking at all the untouched apples. Most people just stayed on the ground and picked only what they could reach. We were up in the high branches picking apples untouched by the mob. I was climbing with one hand and picking and stuffing my sack with the other. Pretty soon my apple bag was just about full. I started to make a few moves to get down and realized I did not have an easy way down, as my bag was simply too big. Kathy was having the same problem. We had to figure a way down. We sat down together on this big branch that was as wide as both of us, and it had a bunch of smaller branches coming out of it on both sides. It looked like I could just keep walking out on it, and it was springy enough that I thought the branch would just bend right down to the ground, and I walked out on it while holding the other branches. It was worth a shot. I put one handle from the apple bag over each shoulder and grabbed on the branches on the side of our big branch. I stood up, a branch in each hand, and the big bag of apples hanging in front of my chest. I started slowly walking down the branch, and it was working. The farther out the branch I got, the lower it got. I was making pretty good progress, maybe only 10 feet up in the air now. Then, snap, the branch broke. Luckily for me, when it snapped, I was moving forward with my next step. I did a somersault in the air and landed on my back, apples still in the bag. No broken bones. And more importantly, my parents or any of Uncle Albert's helpers even noticed. Kathy handed me down her apples, and she climbed down the normal way. We caught up to Mom and Dad and the rest of the kids, who were now in the Granny Smith section. We were all picking and eating and picking and eating. Apples. Apples everywhere. After a while, it was time to head back down to the barn. The sad part, as we were tired and the barn looked 100 miles away, my pops had to carry Karen and Kevin and their apples. Of course, we whined and cried as kids do that we were tired. My mom said to eat some apples on the way down. I had one of my favorites, the delicious apples. We finally made it back to the car. We handed our apple bags to Dad one at a time, and he loaded them in the back of the wagon. I thought we were ready to go, but my dad said, "Let's go pick out the pumpkins." The standard rules for us were that we each got to pick out one pumpkin. I was looking for the biggest one I could find. We all were. To keep his costs down, I'm sure, the year before Dad had instituted a new pumpkin selection rule. You could pick out whatever pumpkin you wanted, but you had to be able to carry it back to the car. If you couldn't carry it, you couldn't pick it. I was playing Steve Austin, the bionic pumpkin hunter. I was running through the pumpkin patch, jumping vines and scooting from big to bigger pumpkins, with the words and music in my mind. A man barely alive. We can rebuild him. Gentlemen, we have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. The technology to make him bigger, stronger, faster, better than he was before. With my bionic pumpkin hunting eye, I scanned the horizon of the pumpkin patch. Do-do-do-do. My eye was focusing in. There was my pumpkin. My bionic eyes focused in on the pumpkin, zooming in for full effect. I sprang over to the pumpkin in slow motion, using the bionic powers in my leg. Upon arriving at my pumpkin, I found it was sitting on top of a sort of an already picked pumpkin pyramid. I started to climb and work my way up the stack so I could reach my pumpkin. I made it to the top of the second row of pumpkins and still could not quite reach mine. My sister Kathy was with me. She made it to the top of the same row. Everyone else was still running around the patch. My dad was a ways away carrying a couple of pumpkins. I showed Kathy which pumpkin I was going for and asked her for a boost. I held up my foot. She cupped both of her hands, bent down facing me. She crossed all the fingers together and placed my foot into her hands. We bounce tested this for a minute or so. The idea I would use her hands as a step, and she at the same time would lift my foot up. That would allow me to reach the top of the pumpkins and get mine. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. I said to her on the count of 3 we would do it. So I bounced twice on her hands, and the third bounce she shot me straight up. On the flight up, I saw all the pumpkins below me and saw the stem of mine. I reached for it and got it. I tried to get a hold of it better, but as I pulled it towards me, it kind of launched me into a somersault as I came down the other side of the pumpkin stack. The pumpkin hit the ground first, and then I came down right on top of it. Pumpkins do break and are quite gushy when they do. I was now wearing my big pumpkin. But I was on the other side of the stack and no one else saw me. I brushed off all the pumpkin seeds and guts as best I could and grabbed the nearest pumpkin just as my dad came around the corner of the pumpkin stack. There I stood, pumpkin in hand, ready to go. My mom and dad rounded us all up, made sure we each had a pumpkin. My mom tried as best she could to have us kick off the mud, pumpkin guts, and other dirt from us. We were marched over to the counter to check out. 5 pumpkins, my dad said to the counter girl. They were all lined up in front of her. My big one down to the baby Kevin's little one. Oh yeah, and we have 5 bushels of apples already in the car. We were marched from the barn to the car, each holding our pumpkins, hoping to make it to the car without dropping it. The ride home was a long one. Each one of us, including my parents, was a little tired and a little sick of apples, although some of us kept right on eating them in the car. What made it even longer was the Marlboro Man. As soon as we hit the open road, my dad rolled down his window a little bit. Then he unhooked the lever on the little triangle window in the front of him, and we all knew what was coming next. Smoke. We all hated it, but there was nothing one could do. You sat in the car, breathed through your shirt, and let it pass. Heck, back then everybody smoked. Dick Van Dyke smoked. Lucille Ball smoked. The news guys all smoked. Everybody smoked. The smoking in the car had a typical pattern. He would start. Mom would start telling him how bad it was for us. We would then all start breathing through our shirts and pretend coughing. The poor guy, we drove him crazy. I'm sure it sucked all the fun and relaxation out of smoking that he was supposed to get. Between the long day, all the apples, the winding roads, and now the smoke, even I was starting to feel a little queasy. My sister Chris, who was sitting behind my dad, had turned pale white and was holding her stomach. I yelled at my mom that Chrissy looked sick. My mom turned around and looked at Chrissy and asked her if she was okay, and she shook her head yes, but I could see that she wasn't. What did I know? We continued up one side of the swirly mountains and down the other. Like a giant roller coaster, we coasting down the side of the Adirondacks. Chrissy was turning whiter, moaning now from the stomach pains. I yelled again. She's going to Ralph all over me. I was sitting next to her. My dad yelled back, Chrissy, are you okay or not? Let me know so I can pull over. She said she was okay. So we kept on going, leaning to the left and then to the right, down one hill, up the other. She was now rolling her eyes in the back of her head, hand on her stomach. I yelled again, she's going to blow chunks. My dad looked back at us and looked at her in the rolling eyes. He saw it now. He knew the danger. My dad had the look of Randolph Mantooth from Emergency. The sirens were now going in his head. He knew the danger of the puke. He was sweating now, looking for a safe place on the mountain road, where to pull over and let the puke fly. My mom reached back for Chrissy to see if she could do anything for her. It was too late. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. A shooting arc of apple chunk-filled puke streamed forward, hitting my dad in the back of his head, down his neck and back, with some residue shooting past him and hitting the inside of the windshield. He now found a place to pull over. He got out of the car, took off his jacket and his shirt, which had most of the puke on it, wiping down his seat and his windshield. My dad, like a soldier in wartime, started barking out orders. To my mom, she was on cleanup duty. She got Chris out of the car and started washing her down. My dad, shirtless at this point, popped the doors and ordered us all out of the car. We were told to stand by the woods between the car and the ditch. My mom and dad cleaned out the car, and my sister. My dad walked away from the Fury 3 wagon. He got a good bit away, reached into his pants pockets, and pulled out his Marlboros. He lit one up, took a drag, and looked at himself first, shirtless by the side of the mountain. Then he looked at all of us. standing by the ditch, facing a car full of apples, pumpkins, and puke. God only knows what he thought to himself. He stood there for a little while, shaking his head and puffing on the Marlboro. He probably never in his life thought that this would be where he would end up. But here we were. He walked back down to the car, opened the doors, and said, "Let's saddle up." And with that, we went home. And that was Chapter 11, Uncle Albert's Apple Farm, from the book Tales from My Bicentennial Year by Michael Buell. And next time will be Chapter 12, My First Mass, An Altar Boy's Hell. Back in a minute. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.